The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above the sterile corridors of Seattle General, a sound that had become as familiar to Laura Bennett as her own heartbeat. She moved through the morning shift with the kind of invisibility that only comes from 15 years of practice, first in the Hindu Kush with a rifle in one hand and a field trauma kit in the other, now in Denver with nothing but a stethoscope and a name badge that read RN, nothing more. Her scrubs were standard issue, the pale blue that every other nurse wore, but underneath the collar, hidden against her collarbone, was a thin scar the shape of a question mark, a souvenir from a moment when shrapnel had come closer than protocol allowed. She touched the patch sewn inside her jacket lining as she clocked in at 0600 hours, a habit, a ritual, the faded Marine Corps eagle barely visible in the seam where only she would ever see it. The patch was from Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, the unit she'd been part of for 12 years before the Pentagon had quietly reassigned her to cover operations that required a different kind of uniform. The morning air in the ICU smelled like antiseptic and coffee and the particular staleness that came from machines running all night, keeping people alive in the narrow spaces between hope and goodbye. Laura's hands were steady as she pushed the medication cart down the hallway, checking room numbers against her assignment sheet, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before, though not in this way, not hiding who she really was. Her fingers were calloused in specific places, her palms bearing the thin white lines of someone who had held scalp blades in operating tents and field tourniquets in the dark, muscle memory encoded in her tendons. She pulled on latex gloves with a sharp snapping sound that echoed slightly in the empty corridor, the motion so practiced it required no conscious thought. In room for 12, General Webb lay sleeping, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical assistance of post-operative sedation, his drainage tubes coiled like dark snakes against the sterile dressing. She checked his vitals with the precision of someone conducting a covert surveillance operation, because that was exactly what this was. 18 months she had been assigned to this hospital, 18 months of careful observation, tracking which staff members accessed Webb's medical records, cross-referencing against the timeline of intelligence leaks, waiting for the pattern to emerge. Her hands logged his post-operative drainage into the electronic system, her eye scanning not just the monitors but the security of the room, the position of the camera in the corner, the sight line from the nursing station. Webb had been her replacement in Helmand Province, the medic who'd taken her position when she'd been reassigned, the one who'd taken shrapnel doing the job that still haunted her dreams with blood and screaming. She didn't let her hands shake. Hands that could hold that together didn't shake. That wasn't allowed. Dr. Pierce emerged from the break room at 0630 like a predator testing the wind, his white coat pristine as fresh snow, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a symbol of office, and Laura saw him register her presence with the kind of subtle contraction that happened in the corner of his mouth, the tell of a man who had just encountered something he found distasteful. His eyes moved across her name badge with deliberate slowness, reading RN, registered nurse, nothing more, and something in his expression shifted into something colder. He was tall, shaped like someone who'd never had to fight for anything, his hands perfectly manicured and unstained by real work, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from generations of inherited certainty. He positioned himself at the medication cart as she was updating Webb's chart, his presence a force that seemed to compress the air around them. The other residents on morning rounds, there were 3 of them, all in their 2nd year, all still hungry to impress, instinctively angled toward him like compass needles finding north. "Bennett," he said, not quite a greeting, more an acknowledgement of her existence the way one might acknowledge a piece of equipment. "Will you be joining us on rounds, or shall we proceed without the nursing commentary today?" The question was constructed with surgical precision, designed to accomplish multiple goals simultaneously, to establish hierarchy, to suggest that her presence was optional and tolerated rather than valued, to plant in the minds of the residents watching that a nurse's observations were somehow supplementary to the real work that doctors did. Laura's jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters, a contraction so small that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would have caught it. Her hands continued moving across the keyboard, her fingers striking keys with the same mechanical precision they'd used 100 times before. She didn't look at him. When she spoke, her voice was measured, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than an ambiguous insult. "Room for 12 is post-op day 2, she said. "Drainage stable at 40 ccs. Vitals holding." She turned to face him then, her eyes meeting his for exactly long enough to demonstrate that she was present and aware and not intimidated by whatever power dynamic he was attempting to establish. "Ready when you are, Doctor." Pierce's smile was the smile of someone who believed the world was arranged in exactly the way it should be, with him at the top of the arrangement, and he turned to lead the rounds with the bearing of a man conducting a symphony only he could hear. The residents fell into step behind him like satellites in orbit, and Laura followed at a distance that was professionally appropriate but emotionally distant, her observation sharp and clinical. She watched the way Pierce examined Webb, too quickly, skipping the drainage assessment, not checking the site for signs of infection, and she made a note of it the way she'd been trained to make notes, not obviously, not in a way that would be visible to anyone looking, but in the part of her mind that had been processing battlefield intelligence for more than a decade. In the break room later, around 0800, Laura poured coffee into a paper cup while Pierce was writing something at the counter, his pen moving with aggressive precision across a piece of paper that looked official. The coffee smelled bitter and slightly burnt, the kind of coffee that came from sitting on a heating plate too long, and she added cream until it turned the color of beach sand. Her movements were economical, the opposite of hurried. She was aware of his attention shifting toward her the way a hawk becomes aware of movement in tall grass. He looked up from whatever he was writing, his eyes narrowing with a kind of theatrical disdain. "You know," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the small break room where 3 residents were also present, all of them suddenly very interested in their own coffee cups, "it would be helpful if the nursing staff remembered the scope of their license. Just because you can observe something doesn't mean you should comment on it. That's how mistakes happen. That's how people die. Nurses practicing medicine without a license." He paused, letting the word settle into the room like dust. "It undermines the entire chain of command." Laura didn't respond immediately. She brought the cup to her lips and took a sip of the bitter coffee, giving herself the space of 3 full seconds to decide which part of herself would respond to this attack. The nurse part, the one that had learned to swallow insults with her coffee. Or the captain, the part that had commanded a medical unit of 27 people in theater and had been trusted to make life-and-death decisions under fire. She chose the nurse. She always chose the nurse, at least on the surface where people could see. Her jaw worked slightly as she set the cup down on the counter with a soft click that was almost a sound, not quite loud enough to register as aggressive. "I understand, Doctor," she said quietly. "I'll be more careful about maintaining appropriate boundaries." Pierce smiled then, the smile of someone who had just achieved what he wanted, and he returned to his paperwork while the residents exchanged glances that ranged from uncomfortable to entertained. Laura remained where she was for exactly 10 more seconds, finishing her coffee in measured sips, her hands absolutely still around the cup, and then she turned and walked back out into the hallway. The door swung shut behind her with a soft hiss, the sound of compressed air, and she didn't let her hands shake. The patch inside her jacket felt heavier today than it had yesterday, as if the weight of her past was accumulating, pressing down against her ribs. She touched it briefly, the faded embroidery rough under her fingertips, a texture that grounded her to something beyond this fluorescent-lit hallway and the careful invisibility she'd been maintaining for 18 months. By 14:30 hours, after finishing her rounds and documenting her observations and attending a briefing with her contact from the Pentagon, a brief 5-minute conversation in the parking garage during her lunch break, conducted in sentences that never exceeded 6 words, Laura sat in her car in the parking lot of the hospital, waiting. The sun was angled across the windshield in that way that made the whole vehicle feel like a greenhouse, and she'd cracked the windows to let in the Denver air, which smelled like high elevation and distant pine and the exhaust from the highway that ran parallel to the hospital. Her phone buzzed with a text from her 13-year-old son, Marcus, who was waiting in the school parking lot and ready for pickup. She had 20 minutes before she needed to collect him, and she spent those 20 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, staring at the hospital entrance, watching staff move in and out through the automatic doors. Somewhere in that building was a man she'd worked with in Kandahar, a medic she'd trained personally, a soldier she'd cared about in the careful, professional way that medics cared about each other in war zones. Somewhere in those corridors, someone was stealing his medical records, and her job, the job she couldn't talk about, the job that paid her $42,000 a year to pretend to be something she wasn't, was to figure out who. She started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward Marcus's school, trying to reconstruct her face into something that resembled a normal mother instead of a woman carrying the weight of a classified investigation inside the seams of her jacket. Traffic was light on the drive west, and she used the time to let the nurse part of her dissolve back into the reconstructing the careful mask of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing dangerous hiding inside her. By the time she pulled into the school lot, she was smiling, not a real smile, but a good one, the kind that would convince a 13-year-old boy that his mother had simply had a normal day saving lives in normal ways, without secrets or past or the faded patch of a unit that had taught her how to do impossible things. The morning round started like every other morning at Seattle General, except Dr. Pierce was already sharpening his knife before he even reached General Webb's bedside. Laura had learned to read the signs, the way his jaw tightened when she entered a room, the way his eyes tracked her movements like she was something that needed cataloging and filing away. She stood at the foot of the general's bed, tablet in hand, vitals displayed in neat rows of numbers that told a story most people couldn't read. Blood pressure trending high. Heart rate elevated. Pain markers spiking. She'd reviewed his medication profile 3 times during the night shift handoff, and the morphine dosing wasn't matching his clinical presentation. Simple math. Obvious adjustment. General Webb's pain levels are trending upward, Laura said, her voice steady and low, addressing the attending physician with proper deference. His vitals suggest we should consider adjusting his current morphine protocol. Maybe increase by 0.2 milligrams per. Pierce's laugh cut her off before she could finish the sentence. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the sound a predator makes when it spots weakness. He turned to face her, surrounded by 6 residents who suddenly became very interested in the linoleum floor tiles. Nurse Bennett, he said, each word placed with surgical precision, when I need a pill pusher's opinion on pharmacology, I'll ask for it. Until then, you chart what I order and let the doctors practice medicine. This is Seattle General, not a free clinic where nurses run the show. The silence that followed tasted like copper and antiseptic. Laura's hand tightened on her tablet for exactly 1 second, a micro-expression that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to hide emotion under fire. Her face remained a smooth mask, the kind she'd perfected across 15 years and 3 continents. She said nothing. She nodded once. She documented the attending's orders without comment and stepped back, her presence becoming the kind of invisible that only happens when someone has learned how to disappear in plain sight. But the knife didn't stop there. Pierce had just sharpened it. Now he was going to use it systematically. By Wednesday, the first formal write-up appeared on the unit board. Laura Bennett, dated and official, citing protocol violations and scope of practice concerns. The language was carefully crafted, vague enough to be unprovable, specific enough to damage. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked for details. The nurses who passed by the board read it and then looked at Laura differently. There was suspicion now. There was distance. Trust had a very short half-life in a hospital, and Pierce had just injected doubt directly into the bloodstream. He'd been working the attendings too. 3 days of careful whispers during morning coffee. She questions every order I give. I've noticed she seems to think she knows medicine better than the physicians. We need to be careful about nurses who overstep, liability issue, you understand. The words were planted in careful soil, and they germinated quickly. By Thursday, Dr. Morrison walked past Laura without returning her greeting. Dr. Huang's tone during rounds had shifted from collegial to distinctly formal. The attending roster had been poisoned, and Laura had never even thrown a punch. The break room became a social minefield. Laura walked in on Friday afternoon with her lunch, a simple salad and a bottle of water, and 3 nurses who'd been laughing together suddenly gathered their food like they were evacuating. Jen, who'd borrowed Laura's stethoscope just 2 weeks before, wouldn't make eye contact. Sarah, who'd complained to Laura about her own abusive ex-husband over lunch for the past 6 months, suddenly found something fascinating about her phone. They left the room like smoke. The silence they left behind had weight. It pressed down on Laura's shoulders and made her lungs work harder. She ate her salad alone and tasted nothing. But the real blow came during family visiting hours on Friday evening. General Webb's daughter had arrived from San Francisco, worried about her father's slow recovery, asking questions the way daughters do when they love someone more than protocol allows. Pierce materialized like he'd been waiting for an audience. He pulled the medication chart with theatrical precision and announced, loud enough for the general's family to hear clearly, "Nurse Bennett, did you really think you caught an interaction I missed? This is exactly the kind of overstepping that endangers patients. You're a nurse, not a physician. Stay in your lane, or I'll make sure you're reassigned to bedpans." The general's daughter's face went pale. The general himself, still fragile in his hospital bed, pressed his lips together and looked away, the body language of someone who didn't have the strength to defend anyone, even someone who'd defended him. Laura's jaw clenched imperceptibly. The smallest muscle tension, the kind you'd only notice if you were trained in reading human beings the way soldiers read terrain. Her knuckles whitened on the tablet for 3 seconds, and then the emotion locked itself back down into whatever vault she kept it in. She nodded professionally. "Understood, Dr. Pierce." She logged the medication correction into the system without a word, her hands moving with the steady precision of someone who'd sutured wounds in the dark by touch alone, who'd done emergency surgery by the light of burning vehicles in the Hindu Kush. Her hands didn't shake. Not in public. Not where anyone could see. It wasn't until her break at 18:47 hours that the trembling started. The supply closet was small and dark, the kind of place where nobody ever looked for anyone else. Boxes of syringes. Bins of sterile gauze. The faint smell of bleach and plastic mixing with something metallic and ancient. Laura stepped inside and closed the door and let herself grip the metal shelf with enough force that her knuckles went white, bone-pale against her skin. Her breath came harder. The professional mask stayed in place, but underneath it, something was cracking. Not from Pierce's insults. Not from the whispers or the write-ups or the sudden social exile. From something else entirely. General Webb was the Marine medic who'd replaced her in the Hindu Kush. Captain Laura Bennett had trained him personally before her reassignment, before she'd been yanked out of the field and given this impossible assignment: go undercover as a civilian nurse, monitor this one patient, identify who was stealing his classified medical records, don't blow your cover, and absolutely don't let anyone know that you're the reason these intelligence leaks even matter. 18 months of careful invisibility. 18 months of watching military intelligence hemorrhage out into the wrong hands while she tried to identify which attending, which administrator, which person in the building was selling secrets to people who would use them to hurt people she'd sworn to protect. And now Pierce was destroying her cover from the inside. The shelf was cold under her palms. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 months of military discipline compressed into a single moment in a dark supply closet, the kind of pressure that builds before something breaks. She gripped the metal shelf until the sensation returned to her fingertips, until her breathing regulated, until the nurse part of her reconstructed itself over the Marine officer part that wanted to walk back out there and explain to Dr. Pierce exactly how badly he'd miscalculated. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that General Webb, still weak, still healing, still the man she'd trained and lost to shrapnel in Helmand Province, was about to lose access to the one person in this building who actually knew how to keep him alive. Pierce had just solved a problem he didn't even know existed. He'd just eliminated the only person who could stop the leak. And what happened next would change everything. The monitors told a story if you knew how to read them. Laura stood at the nursing station reviewing General Webb's afternoon labs, her eyes tracking the downward drift of his oxygen saturation with the kind of clinical precision she'd honed over 15 years, 8 of them in field medicine where a single decimal point meant the difference between walking and bleeding out in the sand. 88%. 85%. The trend wasn't dramatic enough to panic the residents, not yet, but her eyes could see what the algorithm couldn't catch. Compensation. His respiratory rate climbing to compensate for something his lungs weren't delivering. She glanced toward his room, where the afternoon light fell in pale rectangles across the tile floor. Muscle memory was a funny thing. After 18 months of playing the role of careful, deferential staff nurse, her brain still operated like a combat medic, always scanning, always calculating, always 3 moves ahead of the visible crisis. The difference was that in the Hindu Kush, her instincts had been trusted. Here, they were a liability. Here, she was supposed to smile and defer and let doctors with credentials attached to their arrogance make the calls. Here, she was supposed to ignore the voice in her head that had kept people alive when everything was on fire. She pulled up his chest X-ray from the morning, the one Dr. Pierce had personally reviewed and cleared as normal. The image glowed on her screen, all clear lung fields, no pneumothorax marked on the report. But X-rays were flat pictures of three-dimensional problems. They missed things. They missed things all the time, especially when the imaging was rushed and the radiologist was reading through a backlog of 200 studies. Laura had seen field patients arrested from exactly this kind of miss, pressure building in the chest cavity with no escape, compressing the lungs, collapsing them like punctured balloons, oxygen saturation dropping until the brain starved and the heart quit. Tension pneumothorax. Silent until it was catastrophic. She closed the chart and stood, her scrubs crackling softly as she moved. The fluorescent panels overhead hummed their constant mechanical song, the sound so ordinary that most people stopped hearing it after a week. Laura heard everything. The rhythmic beep of monitors down the hall, the distant ding of the elevator, the squeak of rubber wheels on tile somewhere in the distance. A nurse who'd learned to listen, really listen, could hear a patient's decline before any number changed on a screen. The hallway to room for 12 felt longer than usual. Not because the distance had changed, but because something in her had changed the moment she saw General Webb's chart cross her desk. Seeing his name had been like opening a file she'd spent months learning to keep sealed. Marcus Webb, the Marine who'd volunteered to take the combat medic rotation she'd been slated for, back when she was still Captain Laura Bennett instead of Laura Bennett, RN. Marcus, who'd taken shrapnel 3 months into that rotation while she was halfway through her reassignment, lying in a Berlin medical facility while classified files started disappearing from Pentagon servers. She'd watched his recovery from a distance, through reports filed in shadow channels, through the careful surveillance that was supposed to tell her who was leaking information and why. And somehow, impossibly, he'd ended up here, at Seattle General in Denver, on her floor, under her watch. She'd told herself it was coincidence. She'd failed at that lie within 24 hours. The room was quiet when she entered, just the ventilator's soft mechanical rhythm and the steady beep of the cardiac monitor keeping time. General Webb was awake but drowsy, his head turned toward the window where Denver stretched out below them in a patchwork of neighborhoods and highways. He didn't turn as she approached. His breathing was faster than it had been that morning, 26 breaths per minute instead of 18. His chest wall moved with visible effort, the kind of effort that told her his body was working harder than it should be to move air. "How are you feeling, General?" Laura's voice was steady, pitched low so it wouldn't startle him. Professional. Careful. The same tone she used with every patient on this floor, the tone of a nurse who knew her place. He turned toward her voice, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. A ghost of something that went deeper than the formal relationship between patient and RN. Then the moment passed, and he was just a post-surgical trauma patient managing his pain. "Breathing better," he said, though his breathing suggested otherwise. "Whatever you did this morning helped." She nodded, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm with practiced efficiency. 132/85. Elevated but not alarming. She placed her stethoscope against his ribs, listening to the familiar rhythm of a recovering lung. What she heard made her pause. The left side was quiet. Too quiet. Air moving on the right, absent on the left. She moved the stethoscope, checking her assessment. Same result. Diminished breath sounds, all the way down the lateral lung field. Laura's hand stayed steady as she removed the stethoscope. Her pulse didn't race. Her face didn't flush. This was the training in her, the 15 years of learning to process catastrophe without broadcasting it. "I'm going to check your oxygen saturation one more time," she said, reaching for the pulse oximeter on his finger. The small red light flickered as it searched for blood flow, then numbers appeared. 83%. That wasn't compensation anymore. That was collapse. She logged the reading in the chart, her fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision while her mind was already 3 steps ahead. Tension pneumothorax needed immediate decompression or he'd arrest within minutes. The imaging had missed it. The residents had missed it. Dr. Pierce had signed off on the X-ray and moved on, satisfied with his clinical judgment, confident in his competence. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that General Marcus Webb was running out of oxygen, his left lung collapsing, his body fighting for air as pressure built in the space between his ribs. The code button was 10 feet away. One push and every trauma response in this hospital would activate. The problem was that Dr. Pierce had already made it clear he was done with her input. He'd documented her, overreached in the medication interaction case, had gathered allies among the residents who now avoided her eyes in the break room, had positioned her as the problem instead of the solution. Calling a code meant stepping back into the open. It meant suggesting he'd missed something. It meant making her presence impossible to ignore. She looked at the general's face, at the slight blue tinge creeping into his lips, at the way his breathing was becoming more labored with each passing second. She'd trained him. Years ago, before everything changed, before missions turned into surveillance and certainty turned into secrets, she'd taught him how to recognize hypoxia in the field, how to respond when equipment failed and protocols broke down and the only thing standing between a casualty and death was the person kneeling in front of them. Now he was the casualty, and she was supposed to let protocols and hierarchy and 5 months of careful undercover work decide whether he lived. The calculation happened in a single heartbeat. Save him and lose the mission. Stay quiet and lose him. Laura pressed the code button. The sound it made was almost gentle, not the dramatic alarm of television, just a soft tone and a page that would echo through every speaker in the building. Trauma Bay 4, Code Blue. Trauma Bay 4, Code Blue. She was already moving as the message repeated, her hands reaching for the crash cart positioned near his bed, muscle memory taking over like she'd never stopped being a combat medic, like 18 months of playing small and careful had been just a pause in her actual life. "General, I need to help you breathe better," she said, her voice dropping into something different, the voice of someone accustomed to command, accustomed to being obeyed. "This is going to hurt, but it's going to work." She was reaching for the 14-gauge angiocath needle when the door burst open and Dr. Pierce entered with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for an excuse to intervene. His eyes moved from the monitor to Laura's hands to the general's deteriorating condition, and what might have been concern in another person came across as pure territorial aggression. "Step back, Nurse Bennett," he said, his voice the kind of cold that fills operating rooms. "You're off this case, if you recall." Laura's hands didn't stop moving. She didn't look up. Tension pneumothorax. Left side. He's desaturating. He needs needle decompression in the next 90 seconds or he arrests. Get away from my patient. Pierce moved toward the bed with a kind of deliberate slowness that was somehow more threatening than rushing. "I don't appreciate insubordination, and I certainly don't appreciate you practicing medicine." She could feel the weight of the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, hanging in the corner of the room where she'd left her coat. 15 years of Marine service. 8 of them overseas. Countless decisions made under pressure where the cost of hesitation was measured in lives. She'd become a nurse to stay invisible, to fit into a world that needed people who asked permission instead of giving orders. She'd trained herself to defer, to suggest rather than declare, to let mediocrity make mistakes in the name of institutional hierarchy. General Webb's oxygen saturation was 78% now and falling. His eyes were losing focus. His breathing was becoming shallow gasps separated by longer and longer pauses. "Sir, with respect, he's going to die in the next 2 minutes if we don't decompress that chest," Laura said, her voice level and completely empty of question. It wasn't a request anymore. It was information being delivered by someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Pierce's face went tight. He pulled out his phone, thumbs moving across the screen. "Security, I have a nurse on the 4th floor refusing to step back from a patient. She needs to be escorted out immediately for trespassing, Anne." The general's body went rigid. His back arched, his eyes rolling back, his mouth opening as if his lungs were trying to scream but there was no air left to make sound with. 64% oxygen saturation. Laura moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't look at Dr. Pierce or acknowledge the phone still in his hand or register the shock on the faces of the residents who'd just entered through the door. She reached past Pierce, actually moved him physically out of her way, her hand on his shoulder with enough pressure to communicate absolute clarity, and she pressed the 14-gauge needle into the second intercostal space just above the third rib, mid-clavicular line, exactly where a Marine medic learns to press when everything is falling apart and the only weapon you have is the knowledge of where blood and air want to go when they are trapped. The hiss of escaping air filled the room like relief. It was the sound of pressure releasing, the sound of a collapsed lung re-expanding, the sound of someone getting a second chance at breathing. His oxygen saturation was already climbing. 68. 72. 81. Laura kept her hand steady on the needle, her body between the General and Dr. Pierce, her breathing controlled and deliberate while everything in the room went absolutely still. The monitors beeped their rhythmic confirmation. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the hospital, a code announcement continued to repeat in the background, other people running toward this room to help a patient whose life had just been saved by someone who wasn't supposed to be anything at all. The crash cart arrived with Webb's monitor still screaming flatline. His chest wall had collapsed inward like a punctured sail, the tension pneumothorax compressing his heart into a corner of his thoracic cavity, and the resident stood frozen, hands hovering, mouths open, eyes locked on numbers that should never exist. 72% oxygen saturation. Blood pressure unmeasurable. Heart rate gone. The code team leader barked orders that no one executed fast enough because no one understood that this patient was already dead unless someone did something impossible in the next 90 seconds. Laura moved before thought caught up. She shoved past Pierce, his shoulder absorbed her momentum like he was a door, and her fingers found the scalpel on the crash cart's tray in the same motion her knee hit the linoleum. The blade caught the fluorescent light with a thin silver flash. Her mind wasn't in Denver anymore. It was in the Hindu Kush, under the concrete skeleton of a bombed-out aid station, counting ribs on a Marine whose name she couldn't remember but whose blood she could still feel on her hands 23 months later. Fourth intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The landmarks of survival. Her left hand splayed across Webb's ribs, calloused fingers finding the exact space between bone, and the scalpel moved with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure not in a clean operating room but in the dirt and smoke and screaming dark. 3 inches. Deep enough. The incision opened clean and small, and blood welled up like a terrible mouth trying to speak. No one moved to stop her. The residents were watching their careers collapse in real time, but they weren't moving either because what they were witnessing wasn't scope of practice, it was something older than credentials, something carved into the nervous system of anyone who'd ever chosen action over protocol. Pierce was screaming. His voice cut through the room like broken glass, "Stop her! She's practicing medicine without a license. This is a gross violation, document everything." Laura's gloved finger slipped into the incision and felt the rush of air against her skin, that hiss of pneumothorax, that sound of pressure releasing, the exact sensation she'd taught 100 combat medics to recognize by feel alone because in field conditions there was no ultrasound, no imaging, no certainty except what your fingers told you. Positive pressure. She was right. Webb's lungs had been drowning in their own space. She grabbed a chest tube from the cart, a 28 French pigtail catheter, the kind designed for exactly this emergency, and threaded it through the opening with the muscle memory that predated her nursing license by 7 years. Threading. Securing. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone she'd buried deep in scrubs and humility and 18 months of watching and waiting and keeping her mouth shut. The tube locked into place with a soft click and Webb's body convulsed upward as air escaped with a sound like a tire deflating. Then he gasped. Full. Deep. Alive. The first genuine breath of air in 90 seconds, and his oxygen saturation jumped from 72 to 81 to 94 to 100 in the space of 4 heartbeats. His monitor beeped, not flat line anymore, but the return of sinus rhythm. Color flooded back into his lips like someone had switched on a light inside his face. The drainage bag Laura secured to the tube already held 3 milliliters of blood and air, the visible proof that she'd made the only possible choice, and she was still kneeling there, her hand still perfectly steady, when the code team finally arrived as if they'd been running through concrete. 5 seconds of silence. That was how long the room stayed quiet, 5 seconds while Webb's chest rose and fell with real air, with the mechanical proof of survival, with the impossible made routine by someone's hands. Then Pierce's fingers were flying across his tablet. Not to document Webb's recovery. Not to note her intervention. His hands moved with the precision of someone building a monument to his own righteousness, invoking bylaws and regulations, creating a paper trail that would transform an emergency procedure into a crime. His voice came out high and sharp, the kind of voice that breaks things. Everyone here witnessed Nurse Bennett perform an invasive surgical procedure without physician supervision. This is grounds for immediate termination. Document the time. Document the violation. Bylaw 4.7.2 explicitly prohibits non-physician personnel from performing procedures that. Bylaw 9.3.1, Laura said quietly, still kneeling, still staring at Webb's chest rising and falling. Emergency exceptions. Life-threatening crisis where delay constitutes greater risk than intervention. She stood. Her scrubs were spotted with blood. Her hands were steady. Her voice had dropped an octave and something in Pierce's face shifted, a flicker of recognition that this was not a nurse correcting him but something else entirely, something that wore scrubs like a costume. Security was at the door within 4 minutes. They came quietly, professionally, with the kind of courtesy that made everything worse. Laura had already stripped off her gloves and washed her hands at the sink, watching the blood spiral pink down the drain. The termination letter was printed before she even left the unit, a document that cited gross violation of scope and patient safety protocols, that framed her life-saving emergency procedure as reckless endangerment and practicing medicine without a license, that turned the 90 seconds that saved General Webb's life into the 90 seconds that ended her 18-month mission. She surrendered her badge at the security desk on the ground floor. It clattered against the metal counter with a sound like a coin being spent, and the guard who processed her didn't meet her eyes. He'd seen the incident report. Everyone would see it. Within hours, the narrative would be written. Ambitious nurse with a savior complex, overstepped her credentials, got caught playing doctor, got herself fired. No one would know that the patient was the reason she was here. No one would know about the classified marine medical records that had been leaking for 18 months, or the investigation that had turned up nothing because whoever was selling marine combat medical data that could identify wounded operators, location patterns, unit assignments, had been careful. So careful that the Pentagon had sent her undercover as a temporary nurse to watch the general's medical transactions, his visitors, his communications, his everything. And now that was gone. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only physical proof of who she actually was, felt heavy against her ribs as she walked to her car. The rain had started sometime during the code. It drummed on the parking lot asphalt like applause from a crowd she couldn't see, couldn't acknowledge, couldn't thank. She made it home at 4:13 p.m., 13 minutes before her son's school bus would have dropped him off if she'd still been working. The kitchen was empty, the coffee cold from breakfast, the world exactly as she'd left it this morning when she'd been Captain Laura Bennett, designation Nightingale Actual, conducting a classified counterintelligence operation while folding hospital bed corners and taking blood pressure readings and swallowing every instinct to act. She sat at the kitchen table in her scrubs, still bloody in the creases, still smelling of hospital antiseptic and her own adrenaline, and put her face in her hands. Not to cry. Not yet. Just to breathe in the dark behind her palms and understand what she'd done. The general was alive because she'd chosen him over the mission. Because some things mattered more than classified operations and federal investigations and 18 months of carefully constructed cover. Because when a Marine was dying in front of you, you didn't check your clearance level before reaching for the scalpel. She'd known that would end her career the moment her fingers touched his ribs. She'd done it anyway. The front door opened at 5:03 p.m. and her 13-year-old son found her exactly like that, face in her hands at the kitchen table, still wearing her scrubs, tears streaming silently down her face, the kind of crying that makes no sound because it's too heavy for sound. His backpack dropped to the floor. "Mom? Why are you home? What happened?" She tried to find words that fit into a 13-year-old's world. Words that explained how saving a life could cost you everything. How the right choice and the wrong choice could be the same choice seen from different angles. How Mom won't be going back to help people anymore, but that the person she helped today was breathing because she couldn't follow the rules one more second. "I did something today," she said quietly, "that was right. But it was also against the rules." "Did you get in trouble?" "Yes." He stood there with his backpack hanging from one hand, understanding in that way children do when their entire world shifts on its axis. "Are you coming back?" She shook her head. What she didn't know, what no one at Seattle General knew, what the board wasn't convening to discuss until tomorrow morning when they'd review Dr. Pierce's carefully built documentation, was that the general she'd saved was about to speak her name. That the Navy Cross already existed in a shadow box somewhere, framed and waiting. That Pentagon officials were already on their way with classified folders, and the single sentence that would change everything, Captain Bennett's nursing position, was not her primary assignment. But tonight, in her kitchen at 5:07 p.m. on a Thursday she'd never forget, she was just a mother trying to explain to her son why sometimes the bravest thing you can do costs you the most. The hospital board convened at 8:11 a.m. on a Thursday that felt surgically precise, every detail sharp, every consequence crystalline. The chairman sat at the head of the walnut conference table, Dr. Pierce's documentation spread in front of him like a prosecution's evidence, when the conference room doors exploded inward. 14 years old, 5'3", Laura's son stood in the doorway clutching a shadow box of medals, his hands trembling not with fear but with the kind of rage that comes from watching someone you love get erased. Behind him, General Marcus Webb emerged in his hospital gown, drainage tubes coiled against his ribs like mechanical vines, moving with the careful deliberation of a man still learning to breathe without tubes. The room froze. Nobody moved. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. The boy didn't speak. He just walked to the center of the table and set down the shadow box, glass face up, medals catching the fluorescent light like accusations. Navy Cross. Bronze Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Each one polished, each one reflecting decades of sacrifice that Dr. Pierce had never once acknowledged. General Webb stepped forward, still unsteady, his eyes finding the Navy Cross through the glass. When he spoke, his voice came out like gravel, low, measured, ceremonial. Phantom. One word. Her call sign. The room didn't understand yet, but they would. The Marine Colonel entered next, dress blues immaculate, ribbons precise as a accountant's ledger. He approached the shadow box and opened it with the reverence of a priest handling scripture. When he began reading, his voice didn't rise or fall, it simply filled the room with a weight of documented history. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush, Captain Laura Bennett single-handedly stabilized 14 casualties under direct fire when her aid station was overrun. He paused. The attending physicians leaned forward. Utilizing only a combat knife and field expedient technique, Captain Bennett performed emergency thoracotomy on 6 patients with 0 mortality, establishing a precedent for combat surgical intervention now taught in every military medical program in the United States. Another pause. The emphasis landed like a scalpel. Her actions under fire established protocols that have since saved 3,217 lives across every branch of service. Dr. Pierce's face went white. His mouth opened, and he did it. He actually stood up, his voice shrill, trembling with something that looked like panic but was really just the sound of a man understanding his entire position was built on sand. Why does this matter? It's theater. Military theater in a civilian hospital. Captain Bennett violated scope of practice. She performed a procedure without, his voice cracked. Without proper board certification. This is not relevant to a simple termination. Theater. He'd called her service theater. General Webb stood slowly, the motion carrying the weight of someone who'd been trained by the woman in question, who'd learned field medicine at her hands, who'd carried her lessons through 3 tours and come home with shrapnel that should have killed him. He saluted, not the casual gesture of protocol, but the full-body salute of respect from warrior to warrior, fist to chest, holding the position as if his body itself was a declaration. Captain Bennett trained me personally before her reassignment to classified service. She didn't just save my life yesterday. She saved me 13 years ago when she taught me how to think under fire, how to keep moving when everything says stop, how to hold a life in your hands and not let it slip. The doors opened again. Two men in dark suits, Pentagon credentials already visible, walked to the center of the room. The taller one spoke with the precision of someone used to classification protocols, to compartmentalized information, to the careful architecture of secrets. For the record, Captain Laura Bennett holds the code name Nightingale Actual. She was conducting a sanctioned counterintelligence operation within this hospital facility. She was monitoring a high-value military asset for suspected breaches of classified medical protocols related to combat injury analysis. Her civilian nursing position was her primary cover. Her assessment of General Webb's medical status was not within scope of her civilian role because her civilian role was secondary to her actual assignment. The other official nodded. The operation succeeded. The leak was identified. The breach is sealed. Captain Bennett's intervention yesterday did not compromise her classified mission. It completed it. And that's when the real nightmare for Dr. Pierce began. 48 hours later, a video started circulating. Webb's daughter had been sitting in the hallway during the board meeting, her phone recording, and she'd captured everything: the moment the colonel read the Navy Cross citation, the moment Dr. Pierce stood up with his shrill voice dismissing military service as theater, the moment two Pentagon officials entered the room like the final judgment. The video moved through medical social media, then military family networks, then TikTok, then Reddit, then the places where medical professionals gather to talk about their toxic workplaces. By day 2, it had reached Dr. Raymond Cross, Pierce's former mentor at Johns Hopkins, the man who'd written the letters of recommendation that launched Pierce's career, who'd taught him internal medicine 23 years ago when Pierce was still the kind of ambitious young physician who respected the craft. Dr. Cross watched the video in his office in Baltimore, watching his former protégé interrupt the reading of a Navy Cross citation to complain about scope of practice. He watched the shrill panic in Pierce's voice. He watched the general salute. And then he did something that would echo through medicine for years. He sat down at his computer and wrote an editorial for the AMA Journal. When credential becomes cruelty, the Pierce case and medicine's hierarchy problem. 8,000 words documenting how credentialism had become a weapon in Pierce's hands, how respect for knowledge had transformed into contempt for anything outside his own domain, how a Navy Cross citation had been treated as an inconvenience in a scheduling conflict. Dr. Cross cited specific incidents from Pierce's file, the rewritten protocols, the fabricated write-ups, the documented pattern of isolation and humiliation directed at nursing staff who threatened his authority. He didn't just disavow Pierce. He disassembled him, brick by credential brick, in the most prestigious medical journal in the country. The hospital board, facing federal scrutiny for interfering with a classified operation, voted to request Pierce's resignation. When he refused, they triggered a formal state medical board review. Within 72 hours, his private practice patients began canceling. His medical group quietly removed his biography from their website. Attendings who'd once laughed at his jokes now took alternate routes through the hospital to avoid standing in the same elevator. His wife, a hospital administrator at Denver Presbyterian 3 miles away, filed for separation after her own colleagues started asking difficult questions at morning coffee. 6 months later, Dr. Pierce was teaching CPR fundamentals at a strip mall community college in Aurora, Colorado, 53 miles from Seattle General, making $15 an hour demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Resuscian. His hands shook when he counted compressions. They shook worse when he remembered that he'd mocked that same tremor in nurses for years, nurses who'd worked double shifts, who'd held dying patients, who'd carried the weight of lives that weren't technically their responsibility but were morally, spiritually, irreversibly theirs. A resident who'd been on General Webb's unit recognized him during a recertification class, whispered to the other students, and by the final break, everyone knew who he was. Pierce packed up the training mannequin alone in the fluorescent-lit classroom at 9:06 p.m. on a Tuesday, his hands shaking as he zipped the carrying case, understanding with perfect clarity that he'd never walk through a hospital corridor again as anything other than a ghost of himself. 3 weeks after her firing, Laura stood in the rose garden in dress blues that fit like a second skin, like the uniform had been waiting for her all along, patient and certain. The president stood beside her, sunlight catching the Navy Cross at her chest, and presented her with a commendation for dual service. 19 years of combat medicine. 18 months of classified counterintelligence. One decision to save a life instead of protect a mission. The citation read for 6 minutes. During the reading, Laura's 13-year-old son stood next to General Webb, both in dress blues provided by the Marine Corps, understanding finally, completely, irrevocably, why his mother's hands never trembled when lives depended on them. After the ceremony, Webb approached with the careful movements of someone still healing, but his eyes were clear, certain, the eyes of a man whose life had been saved by someone his mind had been trained to trust, even when his cover had demanded he act as if she was nothing. "You taught me how to survive," he said. "Then you saved me. Semper Fi, Captain." Laura kneeled down to her son's level, letting him see the pride she'd hidden for 18 months behind quiet competence and strategic invisibility. The faded unit patch that had been sewn inside her jacket lining, the patch that had been her only connection to who she really was, now sat framed behind the president's desk as a symbol of the thousands of military medical personnel serving in places no one would ever see. Seattle General implemented new protocol requirements for staff respect, regardless of credentials. The briefing room started calling it the Bennett standard. In the break room where nurses had once scattered the moment she sat down, they now sat together without fear. On the unit board where Dr. Pierce had posted fabricated write-ups, someone had pinned a photograph from the Rose Garden, from the moment when the president placed the commendation in the hands of a woman who'd chosen a Marine over a mission, who'd let herself be destroyed rather than let a patient die. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, ever been silenced, ever watched someone with real competence get erased by someone with just a title, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who you really were? Because the truth is, some of the most powerful people in the world are walking past you every single day, and you don't know it yet.